Many aspirants who fail to clear prelims describe paper as unpredictable. But UPSC is not random. It is carefully designed. In the age where the information is easily available, UPSC is not merely selecting the students who has collected more facts. It is selecting the mind that can process the information with precision, restraint, and administrative judgment. Prelims is not unpredictable. It becomes unpredictable only when the student has no decision system. So, UPSC selects an administrative mind. Prelims is a tool that gives every aspirant a fair opportunity to prove administrative decision making under pressure. Imagine you are an administrator. Every day you face multiple situations while working on field and off the field. Those problems won't come to you labeled as polity, economy, geography, environment, or current affairs. They come as real problems like public order, law and order issue, and warning for floods and need of evacuation, ensuring basic public utilities are maintained with resource scarcity or depletion, a protest from the dissatisfied citizens, program implementation problem. In such situations, you must handle emotions, uncertainty, pressure, public interest, rights and duties, authority limits, and ensure peace and stability. This is what an administration demands. But an administrator must have enough basic knowledge across the subjects to think clearly, judge correctly, and take most defensible decisions. This is exactly what UPSC will test in prelims. UPSC will test whether you can handle uncertainty. And this handling of uncertainty doesn't come by reading more and more books and gaining more and more knowledge. You will get it through a structured thinking process, understanding the traps, decoding the claims, and arriving at a proper decision in UPSC prelims. You will never know everything in exam hall. There will always be missing facts, unknown terms, incomplete data, and confusing statements. But the UPSC is not asking, do you know every fact? It is asking, can you think structurally under uncertainty? So, instead of panicking, you must learn to identify the issue, break it into components, analyze the patterns, and apply principles. While evaluating the options, arrive at a most defensible conclusion. Most aspirants fail not because they lack knowledge, they fail because they misidentify the real issue. UPSC surrounds the question with emotional language, political noise, irrelevant facts, and social media opinions with the confusing statements. But an administrator cannot react to the noise. They must identify the core issue. This is the first real skill in prelims. And ask yourself, what exactly is being tested here? What is the actual issue behind the statement? The moment you identify the core issue, half of the options wrong are eliminated and they automatically collapse. In UPSC, clarity is more important than information overload. Once you identify the core issue, the next step is not to search memory randomly. The next step is to apply logic because UPSC does not reward isolated facts, it rewards connection. So every question must be read as a chain, as cause, effect, impact, consequence, and the response. For example, a rapid urbanization is not just a word, it creates a population density. Population density increases water demand, and higher water demand creates water stress. And this water stress require planning and management. This is how an administrator thinks, not in fragments, not in memorized points, but in connected consequences. And once you start thinking in logical chains, the next skill becomes an even more important. Can you break a complex problem into components? Because UPSC questions are rarely simple. They combine multiple factors together. A weak student sees one large confusing problem, but an administrator decomposes it. First, identify the system, then identify the driver, then ask what is modifying the outcome, and finally, what consequences emerge from it. Take an urban flooding. The system is urban infrastructure, and the driver may be very heavy rainfall. But rainfall alone is not the full answer. A poor drainage, unplanned construction, waste blocking water flow, these are modifiers. And once you analyze the components separately, the consequences become clear. This is how complex questions become manageable. And analysis creates clarity, and clarity leads to correct decisions. And once you learn to analyze the problems structurally, the next question becomes who has the authority to act and within what limits. Because UPSC is fundamentally an examination of administrators. Every institution, every constitutional body, every public authority operates within boundaries. An administrator must understand their role, their duty, their authority, their limitation, along with their responsibility. Power without limits becomes an abuse. Power within constitutional limits become governance. This is why UPSC repeatedly tests constitutional boundaries, separation of powers, reasonable restrictions with procedural safeguards, along with the institutional rules. A good administrator is not the one who uses maximum power. A good administrator is the one who knows when to act, how to act, and where to stop. Now comes one of the biggest UPSC traps. Can you separate fact from exaggeration? UPSC will not always give you a completely false statement. Sometimes it gives you a true idea, but stretches it beyond its limits. That is where students fall. A fact says inflation has increased. An exaggeration says inflation is rising like never before. A fact says poverty has reduced. An exaggeration says poverty has completely reduced. In the exam hall, your job is not to get emotionally impressed by the stronger language. Your job is to ask what is the evidence? What is the limit? Is the statement providing too much? Remember this line. Facts are quiet, exaggerations are loud. UPSC rewards the students who listens to the evidence, not noise. Now comes the highest test of an administrator. Can you protect the constitutional values under pressure? Because the pressure will always exist. Political pressure, public pressure, emotional pressure, majoritarian pressure, along with a personal bias. But the constitution was created precisely to prevent power from becoming arbitrary. That is why UPSC repeats justice, liberty, equality, dignity, and constitutional morality. An administrator is not expected to please everyone. An administrator is expected to remain within constitutional values, even when it is difficult. Remember this carefully. The Constitution is not just a document, it is a moral boundary of powers. And in UPSC, whenever confusion arises, the safest direction is usually one of the closest to the constitutional morality. After all this, the final skill is decision making. Because in exam hall, UPSC is not asking you to find the perfect answer. It is asking you to choose the most defensible answer under pressure. That is completely different skill. You may know the fact, but not every fact. You may still have uncertainty. Two options may survive. But now your job is to eliminate exaggerations, test constitutional logic, analyze consequences, respect limitations, and choose the option that survives the maximum scrutiny. This is exactly how an administrator takes decisions in real life. Not with a complete certainty, but with the best available reasoning. And remember this carefully. Prelims is not the test of perfect knowledge, it is a test of disciplined judgment under uncertainty. That is the real skill behind prelims. But knowledge must help you think like an administrator, not just remember like a student, because you're aspiring to be an administrator rather than a technical expert. And once you understand this administrative mindset, you start seeing the UPSC questions differently. A normal student looks at a question as just information, but UPSC frames every question in layers. The first layer is a format, and the second one is a task, and the third is a trap. So, the layer one, while UPSC is framing the questions, how many statements are correct? Which pair is correctly matched? Statement 1 and 2, whether they both explain each other. Which one describes the best? In essence, what does it mean? Which of the following constitute and which of the following are included. These are the most commonly framing formats of the UPSC. After identifying the format, the next question is, what exactly is UPSC asking me to do? Because every UPSC questions hides a task inside it. Sometimes UPSC asks you to identify something correctly. Sometimes it asks you to classify. Is it the right, or is it a duty, or is it a mitigation measure, or an adaptation strategy, a volcanic landform, or a glacial one? Sometimes the task is comparison, not memorization. President versus governor, bioaccumulation versus biomagnification, weather versus climate. Sometimes UPSC want you to trace a process, cause, effect, consequences. And sometimes it tests whether you understand the limits of the concept. And many times UPSC is simply testing whether you can infer the most reasonable meaning from the incomplete information. That is why two students with the same knowledge get different marks. One reads only words, the other identifies the task behind the word. And this is a most dangerous layer, the trap layer. UPSC rarely gives completely unknown questions. Instead, it takes something familiar and slightly distorts it, just enough to break the superficial preparation. A familiar term is placed in a wrong framework. A correct fact is pushed into an extreme statement. Cause and effect are reversed. Two similar concepts are swapped. The right answer is mixed with a one wrong category. And many times, the most attractive option is not the most defensible option. That is why many students walk out saying, everything looked familiar, but I still got it wrong. Because the UPS is not checking whether you have seen the term before. It is checking whether can you detect the distortion. So, UPSC is not a random tricks. They are distortion inserted inside a question format to test a specific decision making skill, that is an administrative judgment. While understanding each and every subject, we may read each and everything in detail. But, however, when it comes to revision and when we are attempting the administrative exam, we need to decode everything structurally. For that, our preparation should be structurally revised. So, for the purpose of a clear understanding of the polity, we have discussed in detail the story behind the constitution, and this is how we have decoded in our module how the constitution works and how to decode it structurally. First, we have divided it into two parts. First, the constitutional relationship between the state and the citizen. These relationships are expressed through values, rights, duties, and constitutional philosophy. While the other part, the institutional machinery that preserves and regulates that relationship. Parliament, executive, judiciary, federal, and constitutional bodies, along with the elections and the procedures which checks and balances each and every power which is established by the constitution or by the law. So, first we need to define the relationship and then build the institutions to protect it. So, the first thing we train the mind to do in polity is this. Before answering, identify the constitutional category and ask yourself whether what exactly is this statement talking about? Is it a right, a DPSP, or a duty? Which constitutional value is under question? And what kind of power, with what limits, or what kind of constitutional remedy? Because UPSC constantly mixes these categories. The directive principles is presented like an enforceable right. A constitutional value is presented like a legal duty. A power is shown without its limits. And the students get trapped because they read the statement without identifying the category. The moment you classify correctly, half the question is already solved. That is why polity is not just a memory, it is a constitutional classification under pressure. After identifying the category, the next step is understanding the meaning of the value given, because many students recognize the term but do not understand what it actually mean constitutionally. For example, the right is just an important idea. It is a legal entitlement enforceable against the state. A directive principle is not enforceable, but it guides the governance. A duty is an obligation. A constitutional value is a moral foundation. A power authorizes the action. A limit restricts the power. And a remedy becomes an active when a right is violated. Now look at what UPSC does. It takes the meaning of one category and silently shifts it into another category, as we have seen in the form of law and liberty or due process of law with a procedure established by the law, confusing the principles of natural justice. And so in this module, we'll not just memorize the articles, we'll continuously ask what does this concept actually mean inside the constitution. And once meaning becomes clear, the next step is we must understand its purpose. Why does a constitutional idea exist at all? Because every constitutional provision exists to solve the governance problem. Some provisions protect citizens from misuse of power. Some guide the state towards the welfare and justice. Some restrain the authority through checks and limitations. Some enable governance by distributing powers and responsibilities. Some try to correct the historical and social inequality. And some preserve the identity, unity, constitutional morality of the nation. Now, this is where the real polity understanding begins. Instead of seeing the constitution as a random articles, we start seeing it as a connected system with purposes. And when you understand the purpose, UPSC traps become easier to detect, because any option that violates the constitutional purpose usually becomes a wrong option. And now we come to one of the most important decoding questions in polity. What is the constitutional force of this provision? Because every provision in the constitution does not operate in the same way. Some are enforceable, some are only guiding principles, some help in interpretation, and some exist mainly to limit power. For example, the fundamental rights are enforceable in courts, but the directive principles are not enforceable, only they guide for the governance. The preamble often works as an interpretative compass and acts as a philosophy. And constitutional limitations prevent the arbitrary exercise of power. Now understand the trap here. UPSC frequently mixes the constitutional importance with a legal enforceability. Student thinks if something is very important, it must be legally enforceable. No, it's wrong. A provision can be constitutionally important, yet not enforceable in the courts. From now on, whenever you read a polity statement, ask one question immediately. What kind of constitutional force does this provision actually have? Now, understanding the previous things, the most important thing is to understand that no constitutional power is absolute, no right is unlimited, no institution operates without boundaries. The constitution constantly balances liberty with order, rights with responsibility, power with restraint. That is why the fundamental rights comes with reasonable restrictions. Freedom of speech is protected but not unlimited. Power exists, but constitutional provisions limits its misuse. Even during emergency, constitution does not completely disappear. Now, this is where the UPSC creates many traps. Students often fall for absolute words like always, completely, unrestricted, or using the term unlimited or cannot be restricted. But the constitutional thinking is rarely absolute. It is balanced, it is conditional, and it is limited by the constitutional morality. So, whenever you read a polity statement, immediately ask, what is the constitutional limitation here? And ultimately, this is what UPSC is testing in polity. Not whether you can memorize the articles numbers alone, but whether you can preserve the constitutional precision under pressure. Because in exam hall, multiple options may look familiar, multiple options may look emotionally correct, but multiple options may even look partially true. So, only one option fully fits the constitution. So, your job is not to search for the most attractive statement. Your job is to identify which option preserves the correct constitutional category, which option respects limitations, which option avoids exaggeration, which option remains legally defensible. This is why the polity is not a memory subject, it is a precision subject. And from now on, this is how exactly we are going to decode each and every polity question in this module. Now we'll decode this previous year polity question based on our logic. This slide has been provided to you in the comment section. Kindly download it. And along with this, we have given you the practice questions too. Now watch carefully how we decode the questions step by step. Step 1. Identify the constitutional idea. Many students immediately start searching for the article number, but UPSC is not asking which article talks about liberty. Instead, UPSC is testing whether you understand the relationship between the law and the liberty. So this becomes an conceptual constitutional question. The real issue is, can liberty survive without legal order? Now, after identifying the core idea, the next step is classification, because UPSC questions become easier when you first identify the category correctly. This question belongs to the constitutional philosophy, not a factual polity, not a procedural polity, and not an institutional comparison. This is a conceptual and interpretive question. And more specifically, it is based on the idea of rule of law in the liberal democracy. That means liberty is not viewed as unrestricted freedom. Liberty exists within a constitutional framework. So now our brain already knows the direction of the answer. A constitutional democracy will never support absolute freedom without law. Now, once the category becomes clear, we move to the functional logic. What does the law actually do in the constitutional democracy? Many students subconsciously think the law restricts freedom, but constitutional thinking says law protects freedom, because law prevents arbitrary power. It regulates conflict, it protects rights, and it restrains the state and the private domination. Without law, a strong dominate the weak, rights become insecure, and the liberty becomes unsafe. So, the liberty is not chaos, it is an ordered freedom protected through the constitutional law. Now we go one level deeper. What is the constitutional source behind this idea? The source is liberal in constitutional democracy. And in such a system, liberty is never protected by emotion alone. It is protected by the institutions and the legal structure. This is why constitutional liberty depends on rule of law, enforceable rights, limited government, and independent judiciary with a legal remedies. This is very important. A dictatorship may also use the word freedom, but the constitutional liberty survives only when these are mechanisms to protect the citizens against the arbitrary power. So now the question becomes even clearer. If there are no laws, no enforceable rights, no remedies, and no institutional restraint, then liberty itself collapses. Now let us see how liberty actually operates in real constitutional life. A citizen is not free because law disappears. A citizen is free because the law creates a protection against the abuse. So the law prevents the arbitrary arrest. Law restrains states' excess. Law protects the citizens from private violence and domination. And law creates the remedies when the rights are violated. So the constitutional liberty is not lawlessness. It is a protected freedom. And this is exactly where the many students fall into the trap. They confuse liberty with the absence of control. But the constitutional democracy believes without protective legal structure, freedom becomes insecure. But there is an important constitutional principle here. Law itself also has a limit. So, a constitutional democracy does not support unlimited state control. Law must protect liberty, not destroy the liberty. So, we must avoid both extremes. So, if there is no law, society becomes insecure and the powerful dominate the weak. But if law becomes excessive, arbitrary, and uncontrolled, freedom gets crushed. Therefore, the Constitution searches for balance. No law leads to insecurity. Arbitrary arrest leads to oppression. A constitutional law creates a protected liberty, and UPSC often tests whether the students understand this balance instead of emotionally reacting to the words like law or freedom. Now we finally enter the options elimination stage. So what UPSC has done, all the four options sound intellectually reasonable. This is not the factual memory question. This is a precision question. UPSC wants to know what option best preserves the constitutional balance. Now examine option A. If there are more laws, there is less liberty. This is an exaggeration, right? Because the quantity of law alone does not determine freedom. and the constitutional law can actually protect liberty. So this option overgeneralizes. So eliminate option A. Now come to option C. If there is liberty, law have to be made by the people. This shifts the discussion towards a democracy and representation. But the core issue is the question is different. The question is about the relationship between the law and liberty, not who makes the law. So this is partially related, but not best constitutional answer. So eliminate option C. Now come to option D. If the laws are changed too often, the liberty is in danger. Again, partly reasonable. But this is about stability of governance, not the fundamental constitutional relationship between the law and liberty. So this also does not directly answer the core constitutional value. So after eliminating option A, C and D, we are left with option B. If there are no laws, there is no liberty. And now it becomes clear why. Because without law, there is insecurity, private domination, violence, and arbitrary power. So the liberty is not the absence of law. Liberty is the freedom protected by the law. This is a constitutional balance UPSC wanted the students to understand. In economy, UPSC does not test whether you memorized terms. It tests whether you can think economically. So instead of learning economy as an isolated facts, we decode every question through a structured system. First, what exactly is the object? In step 2, we have to categorize the term. What type of economic thing is it? Is it a variable, system, government tool, or an indicator, or an outcome? So in step 3, we need to understand what does it directly mean or measure. Does it directly measure something which is factual, or is it evaluating or estimating something else? In step 4, we need to understand the scope. That is, what can it prove? Can it explain or predict something, or evaluate certain value in an economy, or compare it with an other values in an economy, or solve the problems? We need to understand the root. How does it affect the economy? Is it through the policy or immediate effect, or through the transmission, or with an economic impact, or with a final outcome? Now finally, we have to limit the term. What can it not prove? And this is how we will decode each and every topic in an economy, and it doesn't take long for you to master this. It just takes around 5 days for you to master this. In geography, don't memorize the feature first. Trace the process behind it. The mountains, rivers, deserts or climate, vegetation are not random facts. They are outputs of natural systems. So in this course, every geography question is decoded through driver, process, interaction, patterns, and the consequences. Once the students see the process, even the unfamiliar question becomes manageable. In environment, students usually memorize the random terms, but UPSC tests whether you can classify the issue correctly. First, identify the entity, whether it is a pollutant, species, habitat, or some kind of convention. Is it a climate tool, or protected area, or a governance body? Then identify the category. Is it a threat, mitigation, adoption, or restoration issue? Next, understand the degree. That is it a vulnerable, endangered, toxic, restricted, or regulated? Then trace the pathway. Is it through air, water, soil, or a food chain, or through bioaccumulation, or as a climate impact? Finally, choose the response. The protection, regulation, pollution control, or is it for conservation or restoration? Once the student learns this environmental region chain, even unfamiliar questions becomes logically solvable.